Welcome back to our channel. Help us print our next issue by buying us a coffee. Thank you for supporting Archetype.
My name is Sara Aster, and I'm a person who has recently started submitting my writing for publication, although I've been writing for most of my life, and I'm very excited to have my essay published in Archetype's next issue. The essay is called How Shakespeare Sonnets Taught Me to Stop Fearing Sex and Love Plants. Just a really short, snippy title to catch people's interest, you know. I work and live in Ottawa, Ontario.
And can you share a little bit about how Shakespeare Sonnets Taught Me to Stop Fearing Sex and Love Plants is about?
It's an essay in which I read through all of Shakespeare's 150 odd sonnets to review how many of them deal with nature or plants. And then I sort of used that to interrogate my own interest in houseplants and how that is related to my feelings about sex and death, and how Shakespeare's sonnets talk about sex and death. I know that those seem like a lot of really disparate elements, but I hope that I was able to bring them together in an interesting way. Like a lot of people, I became really obsessed with houseplants in 2020 during the first pandemic lockdowns, and I was also rereading a lot of Shakespeare, and the two things just sort of melded in my mind. I sort of started to think of Shakespeare as really kin, because he also, seemed to be in love with someone of the same gender as him, and was reveling in the nature and the plants around him. And that was something that I was experiencing at the same time. So I don't know if that is a great elevator pitch, but maybe a long elevator ride. It's a good pitch for that.
It was a great elevator pitch.
Okay.
I think even the title itself, it gives off such a like, oh my God, what are we getting into vibe? But it completely makes sense. I think in the roots of it all, we're getting down to nature and what are, the roots of us. I'm not the biggest fan of Shakespeare, I have to admit.
Fair enough.
But I love Greek mythology, and there's such a mix of humans and nature, the whole like morphing into, a freaking tree. I'm like, yes, that makes sense. And you start to look at things differently, you start imagining your own morphings into place. Have you had those kinds of experiences besides Shakespeare? I think in during the pandemic, like you mentioned, we have all kind of been doing self-reflections upon ourselves as we take walks or as we look at how we're living now. Has that affected your peace in some way?
Yeah, I think so. And even in what you were just saying, I think something that really interested me in the essay, another aspect, was how language is affected by plants. You said that we think about the roots of ourselves, and obviously, we envisage ourselves in plant-like terms so often. We bloom or we blossom when we're growing. We have roots when we're anchored somewhere. During the pandemic, I surrounded myself with plants, and I started to think about my life in the terms of a plant, which is different than thinking about your life as an animal in a lot of ways. You're much more sedentary, which we all were during the pandemic. We were rooted like a plant is. We didn't have a lot of options about where we could go like a plant. And so we had to employ different defensive mechanisms than an animal, which is nomadic, which can roam and evade danger. And so for me, I was at a very stressful job at the time, and I couldn't escape it because I was working from home and I was living at home, and the stress of that work was always with me. And so I was, trying to think about how can I defend myself from the stress of the pandemic, the stress of my work and my life right now when I am so sedentary. And the plants helped me reflect on that. Also, going to a lot of therapy helped with that. But I do think that the plants had an influence, and a calming influence and a grounding influence. When you start to think about, again, how much our language and how we think about ourselves is influenced by plants, I think you can have a lot of epiphanies about your own life, or at least I did.
This is so off topic, but I'm gonna
That's
make
okay.
it curious. I think it was during the middle of the pandemic, I was so invested in my job that it wasn't until I took a trip up to Nova Scotia when there was literally just mountains and water and trees, that I started, realizing, like, what am I doing? What have I been doing? It poses these questions that I think you really have to see life in its form, and for you, it was plants, and that makes total sense. Like, you didn't have to go all the way to Nova Scotia to see that, and that's amazing, that's great. I should probably do that. I should get a plant to just put in front of me.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend you get one plant because I'm obviously a big advocate for houseplants, but I will say I've never been to the East Coast and I am trying my very best to get out there in the next year. And I do think that those encounters with nature can be so powerful. And obviously, it sounds like it really was for you. And even for us living in Ontario, when we go to our coasts and we realize that people live among the mountains and the water, it just makes such a big difference. So I totally understand that.
And I think this piece came such as a good time. We're ending the pandemic, it feels like, and people are, moving on. They're not going back to that feelings that they had during the pandemic. I think this is such a really good reminder of, hey, you thought about this. You did. Those kinds of feelings. When you mentioned how you thought that sex belonged to the beautiful, do you mind talking a little bit about this and how, young readers might feel about this in the society in this time? I feel like a lot of people are trying to dive this into their writing, but it's so hard. It's really hard to open up.
Obviously, it is a very personal thing to write about, and I was a little bit nervous to submit about it, but I did think that it was a topic that is worth talking about. So I did overcome that to ultimately submit the essay to Archetype, and now people are going to get to read it, which I do think is a good thing, even if it is a little bit nerve-wracking to write about. But yeah, I think it's kind of impossible to overstate how literally I believed when I was a teenager that, well, I'm not beautiful, so I won't get to have sex. I really thought that sex and any kind of physical intimacy with another person was reserved for people who were, considered by society to be beautiful or to be, quote unquote popular in that way that feels so important in high school. And then growing older and realizing that sex and intimacy with other humans is just about kindness and about being open, like all relationships, like all kinds of intimacies or interactions with people. It's just about having empathy with people, about being open to being vulnerable with them and interacting with them. And you don't have to look any certain way to do that. I think that societal norms really push that, For example, if you're fat, you can't have sex according to society. You can only have certain kinds of sex. People make a lot of assumptions about people's intimate lives based on stereotypes. It's just not true. All kinds of people are having sex with all kinds of people, and it's because they're interested in having a vulnerable and intimate experience with someone. And when I realized that, partly through observing plants and partly through becoming interested in plants that looked weird and wonderful and unexpected, in the same way that people sometimes look weird and wonderful and unexpected, that I started to have this little epiphany that, maybe I do look weird, but doesn't matter. If I can be kind to a person and be interested in them and they can be interested in me, then, maybe that's what it's about, not this sort of beauty contest that society tries to tell us it's about. So,
That's really good. Talking about your writing process and how this might have been like an obstacle for you while writing or while submitting, can you walk us through your writing process?
sure. So I have a really bad habit with my writing process where I write something over and over in my mind before I write it on paper, which probably means that I don't do as much actual writing as I should. But it also means that if I'm thinking about a piece for a certain length of time, I finally come to a point where I say, obviously, I'm interested enough in this that I just need to write it down. So that's what happened with this piece. I was rereading Shakespeare sonnets. I was thinking so much about this idea. And then finally, one day, I just kind of hammered it out. Obviously, that's not what I submitted. I reviewed it a bunch of times and submitted it a bunch of times. I think one thing that helped me get over the idea of submitting is that I'd been submitting for a little while and as we all know, most submissions end in rejections. So I kind of told myself, this one will probably end in rejections too. And that won't be such a bad thing because it's a fairly intimate piece. So it's a win-win. If I get published, then that's great. If I don't, then hey, maybe my mom doesn't have to read about my sex life in a literary journal. But you know what? In this case, I'm glad that's what's happened, and especially that it's in Archetype, which I've had such a great experience with. My mom will just have to get over it.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's definitely true. I've had such a bad experience with submitting. Mostly it's just internal.
Yeah.
I'm not even like fully submitting. I'm setting myself up for it, and I end up when I was young, I ended up setting myself for failure. Like I would purposely put a bad draft as a submission because then I know I will get rejected, and it doesn't hurt me because I know it's bad.
Right.
You
You tell
know?
yourself, well, if I'd submitted something good, then maybe it would have been published. We'll never know. Oh, well.
Exactly. Which
Yeah.
is a really bad habit, but we push through. In line of your writing process, may I ask, what are you working on right now?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think the main thing that I'm working on right now is an essay about spelling, which sounds, again, really boring, but I got you to be interested in an essay about Shakespeare, and you don't really like Shakespeare. So I think I kind of revel in picking topics that people might find a little bit dusty and boring, and trying to find an interesting spin on them and make them fun to read about, and maybe, even add some humor in there, as I tried to do in this essay too, in this essay about plants. So yeah, so it's an essay about spelling, and I had a very funny typo related story recently, which I'm trying to incorporate into the essay, but then also talk about how much spelling has standardized over the last 200 years. And even though I think some people sometimes make arguments that the internet has lowered the quality of spelling, I actually think that it's tightened up our standard of spelling because we live with spell check, and we expect to see things spelled correctly a lot more than people, say, 200 years ago did, because they would just write out words, to the best of their abilities, and they didn't have anyone checking it. So I promise that when I write it down, it's going to be a lot more fun than I'm making it sound now. But yeah, that's what I'm working on.
No, it sounds totally interesting. I would really wish that English can just be how it sounds like. I for sure wish that could happen.
And so many languages are phonetic. Like my native language is Serbian, and it's a completely phonetic language. Everything sounds exactly the way it's spelled. So, you
Hmm,
know,
Spanish.
and in Spanish, there you go. Yeah, like there's just so many languages that are like that, and English is just such a weird beast because it has so many influences from so many other languages, so it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I get mad until I realize, okay, so there's a whole story to a specific word. And then it becomes interesting. But if I come across it, it's just gonna be, But
Yeah.
I'm definitely waiting to read your, I think it's an essay, right? To your essay
Yes.
about spelling. I really like the
Thank you.
way you write your essays. They're definitely fun, which is something to say about essays.
Yeah, right. It's a bit of a feat, but that's why I enjoy the challenge.
Exactly. May I ask, how did you become interested in writing or reading personal essays? Well,
Yeah, so I always I feel like writing and reading have been my mainstay interest since I was a child. I mean, I think that's probably true for most people who write, if not all of them. Like writing just feels like something that I have to do to process my life. It's how I think about things. And yeah, I don't know whether that's nature or nurture. I know that when I was younger, my mom would often drop me off at the library for long periods of time. Probably because it was a cheap way to keep me quiet for a long time. That really shaped my love of reading. And even as I've had other interests, like houseplants, for example, or when I was younger, it was dinosaurs, whatever the interest may be, I always engaged with that interest through books, at least through books, if not through books in other ways. So reading and writing were always sort of the mainstays. I sometimes joke that writing was the last hard skill that I learned. And then since then, I've just been trying to play that into different job opportunities. I never really learned another hard skill after that. I did my undergrad in English literature and then just got jobs from there. So it's really how I make my way through the world is through writing.
Wow, I love that last sentence. So going on that, do you remember if you have any early influences that kind of like sparked your love for reading or your love for writing?
I think that I was really influenced by a lot of Canadian and Torontonian authors. I grew up in a suburb of the GTA, and so I grew up in the shadow of Toronto. And I really admired authors from Toronto because they had two things that I really wanted, which was to live in Toronto and to be an author. I thought that both of those things were very cool and glamorous. For example, when I was a kid, I really loved the Silverwing series by Kenneth Opel. It's like a fantasy series about bats. And I don't think Kenneth Opel is from Toronto. I think he's from elsewhere in Canada, but he did his undergraduate degree at the same Toronto University that I did. And when I found that out, I was very excited. And I felt like I had a connection to Kenneth Opel. So a lot of Canadian authors were really inspiring to me growing up, which is why we should publish many Canadian authors. That's my that's one of my central beliefs, is that we should publish Canadian authors because even kids notice it and benefit from it.
Yeah, I feel like that's something that hopefully the Canadian publishing industry is moving towards from what I'm seeing, and hopefully it'll continue. So we really do need Canadian authors. So just to wrap up, what do you think about the term archetypes, or what was the first thing that really sprung into mind when you heard about archetype?
Well, forever, I'm now going to associate archetypes with this lovely journal. But before that experience, obviously I learned about archetypes at school. I learned about the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell and all those kind of things. But I think that archetypes are a really fundamental way that we understand and tell stories. And I think that for that reason, when we start to ask questions about archetypes and our assumptions about archetypes, different archetypal characters or stories or plots, you can go to a lot of interesting places. You can start to understand more about what kind of stories we find important, what kind of characters we find important, and about the stories that we as a society are trying to tell. So I do think that archetypes are really fundamental to understanding how we write and how we tell stories. And sometimes I think that when people talk about archetypes, they want to talk about very ancient societies and how they wrote. But I do think that archetypes are still very prevalent in our writing as people today, and they can be positive or negative. There are some archetypical characters that are harmful simplifications of people, and there are some that are perhaps can be beneficial to a story or a mix. So I think that it's a fundamental building block of storytelling even now, and interrogating archetypes can be a fruitful way into a story, I think.
I love that. Very thorough, going through all of it. I love that. For a really last note, do you have anything you like to say or share to your readers, to archetype readers?
Thank you so much for reading my essay. If you do read it, I hope that it gives you a chuckle or something to think about. I encourage you to read and support Archetype. It's a great journal and a great enterprise. I guess I'll also take this opportunity to plug my book podcast, which is called More Pages. It's a podcast where my partner and I read books and talk about them, and we also compete with each other about how many pages we can each read in a year, and she is really whooping my butt. She's really beating me hard. So if you want to see me or hear me fail on a podcast about books, just search More Pages in any podcast app of your choice, and it is there. So yeah, that's, I guess, all I would say. And thank you for the opportunity to do this interview.
I love that. Thank you for letting us interview you.